So we looked at the fact that Plato was an early rationalist, that he thought real knowledge was something we gain through the senses, and it's achieved not by sense observation, but by our reason. And if anything came through to you in that little video we just saw, hopefully it's the prominence of reason and its place in the views of the ancient Greeks and of people like Aquinas later on. And then, of course, evolutionary theory undermines the claims of the Greeks if it's accepted, because rather than having our reason being a characteristic about us that separates us sharply, separates us in kind from non-human animals, basically for evolutionary theory, as James Rachel's pointed out very well in that video, instead of our reason being something where there's a difference in kind between our reason and anything possessed by non-human animals. After Darwin, the thought was that reason is just different in degree but not in kind, that we just have a better, more fully developed rational capabilities than, say, a chimpanzee or a dolphin. So the rationalist self. I'm going to look a little bit of this. In the old days, I used to draw this whole thing. It seemed to me worthwhile to represent some of these things graphically, and I used to fill up most of about 2 boards drawing this thing. But when we talk about the soul, Plato's kind of talking about not just the immaterial part of our nature, but also our psyche, our whole makeup as a human being. And he thinks that elements of our psychological nature are connected with other parts of our anatomy. In other words, he thinks we have a lower nature, which we refer to as the appetitive element. That is, it's the part of our nature that focuses in on our needs for, as you can see, food, drink, sexual fulfillment, our appetites. And to Plato, and even to Aristotle, this is kind of the lowest part of our human nature. And to go on, virtue in a person, for Plato's ethics, is to gain the personal virtue of self-control or temperance over the appetites that are apropos to our lower nature. So we want to gain control over our desires for food, drink, and sex. Not be a glutton, not be a drunkard, or a sex addict, I guess. And we'll see in later slides, in Plato's ethics, the idea of moderation, which we first kind of saw in Heraclitus' ethics, surfaces again, the golden mean, the idea that the best life is actually a life of moderation. And we see this spelled out when we look at Aristotle's Ethics. We see this spelled out very clearly in Aristotle. So the virtue associated then with this part is self-control. To go up one, the chest is what is associated with our emotional self. And this he calls the spirited element. And the thing is, this threefold division is very similar to Freud's division of our psyche into the ego, the superego, and the id. But unlike Freud, and Freud was influenced by Plato's model, we know that. Unlike Freud, Plato thought that if we correctly channel our aggressiveness, that part of us that has to do with this part of our nature, and channel it properly, we can achieve virtues like courage. Well, to go up one, the head or the brain corresponds to the rational element or reason, human reason. And of course, this is the part of us that desires true knowledge, that desires communion with the forms. Plato thinks that we, as philosophers, should want to know beauty itself, not just particular beautiful things here on this earth. We looked at that earlier. And how do you come to know beauty itself? Well, not through your senses, but through your reason. So it's this part of our soul that is close to the forms. And I have later slides that focus in on this. So, of course, the wisdom of a philosopher has to do with basically the knowledge that we gain through our rational element. Now, I'm going to look at this part a little later. But while Plato thinks that every human being has all three parts, we all have a rational, spirited, and a appetitive element, he does believe that people are born into this life with one or the other of those elements dominant. And so we're going to see that if you're the sort of person who's dominated by these appetites, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Plato thinks that you should naturally filter into occupations, and these people will naturally filter into occupations that have to do with the fulfillment and the provision of these appetites. That is, these are the people who will be the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker, as well as the banker. The business and money class he also put in this area. People who are dominated by the spirited element in society, he thinks these people are people in whom the virtue of courage is better than it is in other people. And so they naturally would filter into occupations where courage is a major factor, or a major characteristic that would lead to your success. And so they should be career military people or, career police. And Plato also calls this class the auxiliary class. I go to a sale often run by a hospital auxiliary at GBMC, it turns out. And, you know, an auxiliary is something that goes alongside and supports the main thing, you know. A hospital auxiliary, is a part of the hospital that goes along and supports the main mission of the hospital. And so Plato thinks that the military and police classes, their chief function is to help the ruling class rule. And the ruling class he calls the guardians or philosopher kings. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not that if Plato were a plumber, he would be arguing that a just political state ought to be ruled by plumbers. But we'll see that he's got specific reasons for his claim that the best form of government is not a democracy. Now, why does he think this? Who rules in a democracy, in a real democracy, right? Is it the rational elite? Or is it, you know, if it's one man, one vote, or one person, one vote, isn't it more people from the artisan class? Plato thinks this is not good. Ruling a just state, he thinks, is a job best left up to experts and best left up to those who know things like justice better than anyone else. But justice, we saw from that discussion of Socrates with Thrasymachus, is a form, an ideal entity best known by reason. So who would know more about things like justice than those in society who excel in their rational abilities? And by the way, Plato thought that women as well as men could be in the ruling class. He calls them the guardians of the state, so they're also called the guardian class. So who should we have in the ruling elite? Basically, philosopher kings, people who excel in their rational abilities, and Plato is just convinced that they will rule a state more justly than anybody else. Now, he might be a little naive in that. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But to look a little bit more at Plato's idea of our structure as human beings, we already saw that he and Socrates think that we are a soul with a body. And the characteristics of the soul, we'll see, are very similar to the characteristics of the forms. So our soul and the rational part of us, its characteristics are most like those of the forms, and so that's the reason for our desire to want to be with the forms. So the soul, he says, resembles that which is divine. You know, and here we have the influences of Parmenides. It's intellectual, it's rational, also immortal, right? It, by nature, is not the sort of thing that can be dissolved. For Plato, the soul, that the sort of kernel of us that is our soul, is not divided up into parts. Yes, our psyche is, but the soul isn't, the part of us that goes from body to body. And so the soul is more like a mathematical point. It is unitary. It does not have parts. And by its very nature, and this is argued by both Socrates and Plato, by its very nature, the soul is not the kind of thing that is subject to dissolution. It can't dissolve into parts because it is not composed of parts that it could break down into. Well, if this is your view of the soul, that it's kind of like a unitary entity, like a mathematical point, then this gives you a ready-made argument for the soul's immortality, right? The soul, by its very nature, is just the sort of thing that can't break apart and dissolve. It's also invisible, not something we can experience with the senses. And in the tradition of Parmenides' unchangeable. Now, here's the controversial part. If the soul in us is more like the divine, for both Plato and Aristotle, it is in the nature of things that the gods should rule over us, that the divine should rule over the merely mortal. And by parallel thinking, it is in the nature of things that the rational part of us should rule over the other parts of our body. And to go back to the previous slide, that's how we achieve these virtues. In other words, we achieve self-control when we allow our reason to enable us to make choices that lead to a moderate lifestyle in the areas of food, drink, and sex. Plato's not recommending the life of an Eastern mystic, a life, an ascetic life of total self-denial. Plato knows that we have these natural desires, but he's saying if we use our reasoning abilities, we can keep them in check, and that will produce in us virtues like self-control. Likewise, and we'll see this more in Aristotle, but likewise we can produce courageous behavior by keeping our spirited element positively filtered, and controlling emotions like anger and filtering them in positive ways. So, to go back. So the soul for Plato most resembles the divine. The body, what is that like? Well, that's most like that which is perishable and mortal, right? It doesn't think, okay, the Greeks would totally deny the assumption of modern materialists that we're nothing but a material being, and that the brain or matter is capable of thought on its own. The Greeks would have denied that. The body is mortal, that is, it's going to perish. It's dissoluble, right? Our body is going to decompose and decay at death. This is not news to any of us. It's obviously visible and capable of change. And so, in the nature of things, both Plato and Aristotle think that as the divine is meant to rule over us, the divine part, the rational part, should rule over the appetitive part of our soul, and that's how we become the best human beings. But also in a state, again, those who excel rationally should rule over those who are driven by the other elements. So another comparison worth making is the distinction between the forms and objects in this world. And you can say, well, what is the soul most like? The forms or stuff in this world? Well, you know, we saw the forms are true existence, and the forms themselves resemble the divine, being intellectual, indissoluble. In other words, perfect beauty is never going to dissolve into anything else. The triangle, the form of triangularity, is never going to dissolve. It's eternally the same. And of course, we saw that the forms are not known by our senses, but by our reason, and they're unchangeable. What it is to be a triangle is something for Plato that's established eternally in the nature of things. It's never going to change. It will always be the same, what it is for a triangle to be a triangle, a circle to be a circle, a square to be a square, or justice to be justice. So the forms are perfect and good, whereas earthly things, he thinks, are a combination of matter and form. In other words, if we call, I don't know, it's always difficult to discuss these things because what are they? Desks or tables? Well, if we call them desks, we can say, well, this particular desk or table is a combination of matter and the form of tableness or deskness that makes it up. But the form is not perfectly realized because imperfect matter keeps the form from being, ideally copied. See now, you all grew up in the digital era, and unless you're like into getting back to vinyl or something like that, in the old days, you knew that if you tried to make an analog copy of something, like some of us would preserve our vinyl records by making a really good cassette tape and playing the cassette tape so that you weren't wearing out the vinyl, but you knew that cassette, that analog copy, see, it's different in digital because ones and zeros are ones and zeros, whether they're on a record or a tape or some other medium, a flash memory. Ones and zeros are still ones and zeros, and so that's why when you copy a CD onto a blank, the copy's as good as the original. But in the old days, the more you copied something, I mean, suppose you would loan your tape of an album to a friend. Now, your tape was not as good as the original vinyl album, but your friend has a dual cassette deck, which we used to have in those days, that can make copies of the cassette. So they decide, well, you know what, I like this album, and I'm going to run off a copy for myself, a tape for my... Well, that tape is not going to be as good as the original. There will be a deterioration. And that's kind of what Plato's view is of things, that stuff in this world is always going to be an imperfect copy of the original in the world of the forms. So the forms are perfect and good, and earthly things are imperfect. And so earthly things resemble that which is mortal in us, not intellectual or capable of thought. They can be dissolved because they're composed of parts. They're visible or accessible to our other senses as well, and changeable. And to a certain degree, they fall short of the perfection of the forms. And for Plato, the cliche that's often thrown out in this regard is for Plato, and for Socrates as well, to be less than good is to be less than real. The form of the good, goodness itself, we saw that that's what's represented by the sun outside the cave. That's the most perfectly good thing there is. Everything else falls short of the form of the good, but may strive to be like it. So for Plato, everything else is to a certain extent less good. But if it's less good, it's also less than real. So that's why, see, we think these things, like particular death, or maybe easier to illustrate with a particular triangle, we think, well, this triangle I'm now drawing is real. There it is on the board. It's real. A perfect triangle is just an imaginary triangle. But for Plato, that triangle there is less real than the form of triangularity, or the triangle, in the intellectual world. It's an imperfect copy of it. So, things in this world then are imperfect and to some extent evil. To be less than good is to be less than real. And again, for us, existence is an all or nothing thing. Right? A thing either exists or it doesn't. For Plato, there are degrees of existence. So he's got a whole different way of looking at the earth. So, forms versus earthly things. Not worth staying here for too long because we already went over this. Right, perfect equality, perfect beauty, justice, perfect triangularity, those are all forms, and they're general. They apply to more than one thing. Earthly things always exist as particular things, right? A particular triangle like the one I just drew on the board, or a particular desk or table like the one that's there, or a particular lectern. So again, you can kind of see the basis of this confidence that the Greek or early Greek philosophers had, that our reasoning abilities give us a better, deeper, more lasting insight into the nature of things than our senses. Because it's by our reasoning abilities that we know true reality, the forms. So inward reflection then, use of our reason within us, puts us in touch with the forms, right? Meno's slave boys using his reasoning abilities to recall what he had known of the forms of geometry and those eternal truths. So by sight we know only particular things, by reason we know only particular equal things. By reason we know the form of equality, or equality itself. By sight we know only particular beautiful things, like a particular beautiful rose. By reason we know beauty itself. And we saw that this is what Socrates and Plato think is the goal of, that every philosopher should want to pursue, to know not just particular beautiful things like that's what's important to the ordinary man on the street, so to speak. We, as philosophers, want to know beauty itself, which is a higher goal for Socrates and Plato. And he thinks the rational part of us, our soul longs to be where it once was, communing with the perfect forms, right? I already told you that Socrates argues that we can't even make an ordinary judgment like two pieces of chalk right out of the box are equal in length but not perfectly equal in length without knowing what perfect equality is, and perfect equality is a form. And since we encounter no two things, like no two lines are perfectly equal in this world, how do we come by our knowledge of perfect equality? Well, we were acquainted, or our soul was acquainted with this before it became incarnated in our present body, and we want to get back there. I told you in the Phaedo, Socrates says, well, philosophy in one sense is really a practicing for death. Now, I said we don't tell you that when you sign up for a philosophy course, or maybe we'd have some people bail it out, you know. You want to sign up for Philosophy 101? No, wait a second. You know that course is really a practicing for death. And somebody would say, oh, it's a practicing for death. I don't want that. You know, let me look at anthropology or something. You know? But this is Socrates' claim. In other words, that we're trying to get knowledge of the forms here on earth, but it's merely practicing for the time when we're going to know them better, when we're separated, again, from this evil material body. So we just made the points about perfect equality being elsewhere. So you saw at some length in the video Plato's image of the chariot and the charioteer, right? Who's the charioteer here? What does he represent? And there are really two horses, a noble horse and an ignoble horse. Mm-hmm.
Just a quick question. You said that philosophy is essentially practice for death. Does that mean rationalizing and coping with death? Is that what you mean by that?
Now, okay, there was a person who gave a whole paper on that from Towson last spring, and that is the way many modern philosophers would say, well, why is death an evil? If we took a materialistic view and think of it as a cessation of existence, why is that an evil? And will it help you cope better with it? And there were other philosophers, like the Stoic philosopher. I'm drawing a blank. Are in the Enchiridion, he argues about how we can cope with death if we don't have a hope for an afterlife, which the Stoics didn't think there was. So that's certainly part of what many philosophers have discussed in connection with death. But here, Socrates is trying to argue that, hey, wait, why? Socrates claims at one point that the person who fears death is not wise. Why? Because they think they know something about death that they really don't know, and that is that death is automatically an evil. Socrates is saying, hey, maybe it's a good. Maybe after this life I go to commune with the forms and be with other philosophers and stuff in the afterlife, and why is that an evil? So he says, you know, death may be a good. He also says it may turn out to be an eternal sleep. There may be annihilation. Socrates does admit that while he's confident the soul is going to go on living, he doesn't know that for sure. But he certainly argues that, right? No, it's a practicing for death in that in coming to know more about what is justice here, what is virtue, what are these things that we're trying to define. See, if you can define something, you capture its form or its essence. If I define a triangle as a plain geometric figure with three sides and three angles that add up to 180 degrees, I've captured its form. But other concepts like justice, piety, they're harder to get a handle on, right? But so the idea is it's a practicing for death here because we'll really know these forms much better again when the soul's separated from the body. But we're trying as best we can in this way to get as good a knowledge of what we once knew in a much better way, right? We're trying to recollect what we once knew. Meno's slave is trying to recollect his knowledge of geometry. And so it's a practicing for death because we're trying to know the forms as best we can in this life. But we know after death we'll know them better if we seek to do so in this life. See, there's a catch here. So that's, I think, the sense in which he thinks of philosophy as a practicing for death, that we're trying to gain as much knowledge of the forms here on this earth as we can, but we'll know them better after death. But that's what we ought to be about. But the catch is, as we'll see later, if you put too much of your thinking toward the earthly, toward satisfying just the appetitive, the desires of the appetitive element, your chariot gets drawn back to the earth. So the idea is there are two horses, a noble horse and an ignoble horse. And what do you think what classes do you think these represent? And what does the noble horse do? In other words, the noble horse tries to assist the charioteer in keeping the, I have a friend who raised horses. I'm going to many horse shows with her, and sometimes you get a horse that is just unruly, right? You don't want an unruly horse pulling a chariot. So the noble horse assists the charioteer in keeping the appetitive element in line, the appetitive element, the ignoble steed in line. What does the ignoble steed represent? Well, that's the classes. It's in a human being, right? It's our appetitive nature, which we want to use reason, the charioteer, to keep in line, but we're also assisted by our spirited element. And in the ideal state, we said the police soldier class, the class in whom the spirited element dominates, are the auxiliaries. Their job is to assist the ruling class in keeping the riffraff, the common person, in line, and keeping everything in harmony. So the charioteer is reason in Plato's view. So the point of the image is that reason ought to rule, and those who excel at reason ought to rule a just state. When reason rules, then we become just individual persons. When reason rules, we also fare better in the afterlife. Our chariots are carried to the invisible intellectual world where we behold true being. And we might even join up with the gods there. But so reason can rule over spirit to moderate our anger and aggression, right? Reason can rule over our lower nature, the appetitive element, to moderate our desires for food, drink, and sex. and we produce the virtues. Courage is produced when reason controls aggression and fear. Temperance or self-control is produced when reason reigns over the bodily appetites. And we see Aristotle develops this theme more fully when he talks about virtues. Now, justice, though, remember we saw Thrasymachus didn't quite know what justice was, but Plato develops the notion of justice later on in the Republic, after he has Socrates shoot down Thrasymachus' view that might makes right, justice is whatever is in the interest of the ruler. A just state for Plato is like a just person. So each part of our soul has a particular virtue associated with it that we're going to realize if reason rules, right? Reason rules the appetitive element, you get temperance or self-control. Reason rules over the spirited element, you get a virtue like courage. Reason rules over itself, there's where you get wisdom. But justice for him is not associated with a single part of the soul, but a just person and a just state. Both of those occur when you get all of the three parts working in harmony in the way that they ought to work. That is, reason in control being assisted by the spirited element to keep our lower nature, the appetitive element, in check. And similarly, you get justice in an ideal state when the ruling class, the guardians, assisted by the military and police, rules over people in the rest of society. And so, yes, it does lead to an authoritarian politics, right? A just state for Plato should be ruled by an elite few, the philosopher kings, those who excel at reason. And for Plato, it's actually wrong for you if you're dominated by the appetitive element to want to be, say, a career police officer or a career military. You're meant to be in the artisan class, not in the military class. If you're dominated by the spirited element, Plato doesn't want any Muammar Gaddafi's or Fidel Castro's ruling his ideal state. He doesn't want, or Saddam Hussein's, he doesn't want any military leaders, right? If you're meant to be in the police soldier class, it's wrong for you to want to be in the ruling or guardian class, okay? Yeah, we said it's ambiguous as to whether we had to 20 after or 25 after. We're going to go over one more slide and then move on. So what happens if reason doesn't rule? Then our chariots are pulled back to this earth. Our souls become polluted. Folks, I didn't make this stuff up. It's in the end of the Phaedo, that dialogue. They're ruled by bodily desires and pleasures. That is, if we give in too much to our lower nature, they see truth as only what the senses can experience, and they don't seek truth in the realm of the forms. And our polluted souls, drawn back to earth, end up doing things like prowling around tombs and sepulchres. We can't ascend to where the forms are. So, hey, there's a side benefit to philosophy. Less of a chance you're going to end up as a polluted soul wandering around graveyards after death by taking this course. You know, so there's a positive, right? As Bill Murray says in Caddyshack, you know, when the Dalai Lama says you're going to achieve total enlightenment after death, he says, well, hey, no tip today, but total enlightenment after death He says, hey, I got that going for me. So you got that going for you. So to deal with the forms, we'll see you on Thursday. Look, just because Plato said it doesn't mean that it's necessarily right. We'll see y'all. If I miss you when I call the roll, let me know. So the test a week from Thursday, not a week from today. Take care. If somebody can click the light on, that would be great. Let me just stop this recording.